I participated in the EPIIC colloquium this year, and I'm honored to be moderating this panel on identity, integration, and the future of the nation state. Earlier today and last night, our panelists framed recent shifts in economic structures and climate change as the foundations for institutional instability in the 21st century. Political stability is not simply threatened by the new ways we work, make money, or treat the earth. However, our conceptions of ourselves and others and the methods of affiliating with the nation state are in question as well. In Plato's Republic, the city is a form of association and defined. Over the centuries, the legitimacy of the state has been based on heritage, religious right, and the popular mandates of democracy, socialism, and communism, but the willing affiliation of individuals has been maintained as the foundation of just governance. In the decades of decolonization and self-determination since the Second World War, the definition of the state has depended on the identity represented therein and the willingness of the state to define requirements for its citizenship. Religion has been erased on the French census but institutionalized in Iranian theocratic conservatism and invoked worldwide to justify both acts of charity and crimes against humanity. Popular legitimacy based in ethnic nationalism has been claimed by various vying groups within the United States and abroad, despite the role of racial affiliation in communal violence and genocides within the past few decades. Across the world, nation-states have been choosing daily how to integrate and accommodate incoming refugees and immigrant populations as economic and climate-based factors force individuals to join new communities and redefine their geographic identity. The state is not only acting upon these new citizens and inhabitants, but the individuals within the state also define and legitimate the state system, leading us to ask whom the state serves and how it can effectively do so in a world so quickly changing. These philosophical questions echo those which Plato began with. What does a just government which serves a willing populace look like, and how can we move towards achieving one? To answer these questions, I'm honored to be joined by experts from across the board on identity, integration, and the future of the nation state. Our speakers will each share comments on the topic for 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will have moderated discussion within the panel and then a period for student questions. I would like to ask our speakers to keep their comments within the time. We have a light at the front to indicate how much time is left for comments. First to speak will be Dr. Yascha Mounk. Dr. Yascha Mounk is a recent PhD from Harvard University and has been writing on the collapse of liberal democracy and the rise of both illiberal democracies and undemocratic liberalism. Dr. Mounk's research on the decreasing faith in democracies has been widely discussed and publicized and has sparked conversations on the livelihood of liberal democracies and revitalizing civic culture in and out of the United States. Dr. Mounk will speak on the current state of liberal democracies domestically and their consolidation, endurance, and collapse. Dr. Mounk, without further ado.
So I actually want to reflect a little bit about nationalism. The title of the panel, I suppose, is Identity, Integration, and the Future of a Nation State. And I've really changed how I think about the nation state over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, and I think it's worth trying to grapple with that. I grew up to Polish parents, born in Germany. I've lived in England and Italy and France. I went to a school financed by the European Union for part of my high school education. And so to me, it came very naturally to hope in a certain kind of sense that we would move beyond the nation state. And that's something that it's easy to forget now. 5 or 10 years ago was very fashionable still. We thought that in the new global order, cities were more and more important. So perhaps cities would substitute for nations as a primary identification for people. We thought that globalization would tie different nations closer and closer together. And there is, after all, something pretty artificial about the nation state. It is odd that when you watch the Olympics, somebody from, say, Detroit and somebody from across the way in Toronto cheer for opposite teams, whereas somebody from Detroit and somebody from El Paso, Texas cheer for the same team. Surely the first two have more in common than the latter two. And so there is a lot of hope and in some quarters apprehension about the withering away of a nation state. And I think in light of not only the last elections in the United States, but in light of Britain's decision to vote for an exit to the European Union, in light of the strong rise of populist nationalist movements in Eastern and Central and Western Europe, in light of the fact that even in countries as far afield as China and India and so on, there is a new, more robust nationalism than there was 5 or 10 years ago, we're starting to see that that may not be the truth of it. That actually, the more people feel unmoored by economic developments, the more they feel that globalization is changing their world, the more they are clinging and doubling down on certain existing political forms, the nation state being most strongly among them. And so the first point I want to make is that though I feel in some ways normatively ambivalent about the nation state, I think that we have, to all intents and purposes, to give up on the expectation or the hope that globalization, that economic developments, that cultural developments, the rise of digital technology will somehow lead to the end of a primacy of a nation state. The nation state, for the foreseeable future, I think at least for our lifespans, is here with us to stay, and it's got to be the starting point to our politics. The second is that the big battle of the next year is going to be over the nature of a nation state. That one of the things that explains the rise of populism and far-right populism in particular in the last elections in the United States, but also elsewhere, is a kind of rebellion against pluralism. And it's most obvious in countries outside North America, where countries that have always been mono-ethnic and monocultural, that were founded on a strong idea of what it is that makes a true Frenchman, a true Italian, a true Swede, a true German, are starting to have to learn that after years of immigration, actually perhaps the picture is more complicated. That somebody of Moroccan origin can be French, that somebody of Turkish origin can be German, that somebody of African origin can be Swedish. And there are parts of the population that are willing to accept that, but there are very large parts of the population in all countries outside North America that are not willing to accept that. And so the debate is going to be as much over which nationalism and who gets to be a member of a nation as it is about whether or not we'll have a nation state. The picture in the United States and Canada is a little more complicated because it's always been a multi-ethnic society, but it used to be a racially hierarchical multi-ethnic society in which African Americans were thought to be American in a way that Turks for a long time were not thought to be Germans, but they were thought to be lesser, with fewer opportunities and not the same social standing. And as that's starting to change, as we've experienced the first black president of the United States, as we see institutions like the Supreme Court diversifying, you have a very similar phenomenon to what you see in Europe, which is that parts of the population accept and even embrace that, and parts of the population rebel against that. And that rebellion has a real political potency, which has the potential of shaking our political institutions in pretty radical ways. And this is something you've seen playing out. Now, you might ask, what about economics? And I don't want to talk too much about that. I just want to say that, as I hope you've learned in your social science classes here at Tufts, the social world is not monocausal. Two different causes can go on at the same time. So a lot of the debate that we've had in the United States for the last months about whether it's sort of identity and racial questions or economic insecurity and distributional questions that has driven the success of people like Donald Trump, I think is the wrong question to ask, because both of those things can be present at the same time, and moreover, they can reinforce each other. We know from many studies in social psychology that when people feel economically secure, they tend to be much more tolerant. And when you induce a little bit of economic anxiety into them, they start drawing much starker distinctions between the in-group and the out-group. So the fact that living standards have always risen through the history of democratic stability in the United States, that it doubled from 1935 to 1960 and doubled from 1960 to 1985 and has been stagnant for the last 30 years, helps to explain why somebody like Donald Trump could have won the presidency. But it also helps to explain why some of those feelings of worry about outsiders, some susceptibility to forms of attacks on ethnic and religious minorities could resonate so strongly at this particular moment. So these two things are additive rather than divisive. So what do we do about all of this? Well, I think it has to be a matter of rethinking how we can reconcile globalization, the nation state, and democracy. Danny Roderick, a political economist at Harvard, has come up with a famous trilemma. So if you outgrow the dilemma and you want to prove that you're more smart than that, you come up with a trilemma. And the idea of a dilemma is you have to choose between one and the second thing. The idea of a trilemma is that you can have 2 out of 3 things, but not all 3. And he argues very persuasively that there's a trilemma, which means that you can have the nation state and globalization, but not democracy. You can have globalization and democracy, but not the nation state. Or you can have whatever the third pairing is. I've lost my train of thoughts. But you see the idea, right? There's a nation state, there's globalization, and there's democracy, and you can have any 2 of those 3, but it's impossible to have all 3. Well, I think the big political task of the next 25, 30 years, a political task that I hope a lot of you will spend good time thinking about and helping us solve, is to prove Danny Roderick wrong. Because we cannot stop globalization, even if we wanted to, and a lot of economic developments are to do with automation and so on, so even if we put up a bunch of tariffs with Mexico, it's not going to help us. The forces unleashed by globalization, technological progress are going to stay with us. We cannot get rid of a nation state because citizens weren't bad. If you try to move away from a nation state, what you get is an even worse political reaction. And we don't want to give up on democracy. So we have to think about how the nation state can regulate globalization and make it work for its own citizens. I've been thinking a lot about the slogan on which the Brexiters won the referendum last June in Great Britain. The slogan was not "Make Great Britain Great Again," though it might have been. It was "Take Back Control." And there's something nasty to that. The idea was that we didn't have control because all these dangerous foreigners are coming in and we got to stop that, and there were some posters to that effect. But I think there's something to that that's understandable. It's understandable that citizens are saying, I feel like our nation is not in control of what's happening to it in the age of globalization, and I feel like I individually am not in control of my life, and the government tells me, look, if your job's going to go away because of automation, learn coding, and if you're not smart enough to learn coding quickly, then tough luck. And so I think we have to think about what resources the nation state has in order to signal to its citizens that it's in control of its own fate in the age of globalization, and in order to make sure that citizens feel in control of their own lives. So to me, the big political challenge of the next 10, 15 years is how to domesticate nationalism in a way that stops it from turning nasty, and use it as a tool to give people the feeling that they remain in control of their lives and their collective fate in the age of globalization.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mounk. Next, we will have Dr. Randy Kluver speaking. Dr. Kluver is a professor of communications at the University of Texas A&M and is an expert in new and global media. Dr. Kluver's recent research has featured the geopolitical implications of mass media use and media monitoring technologies, specifically in the United States and East Asia. Dr. Kluver will discuss the implications of the rise of network society for national and geopolitical identity, and how technological networks serve to undermine national boundaries and develop new social configurations based on information flow.
Thanks so much, Eva. Is this mic working okay? Okay. I want to start first just by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's not often a professor of communication gets invited into such august rooms, and you'll probably regret it soon. I'm going to respond a little bit to Yascha's remarks, but move on forward. I find it interesting. Here's the one thing to take away. The literary critic Kenneth Burke coined the phrase occupational psychosis. And what he meant by that is whatever your occupation is, gets you fixated on one element of life. And so you see the world through that lens. That both opens up certain kinds of things to you, but it also blinds you. And so whatever your occupation is, that's how you see the world. The organizers of the conference have demonstrated they don't have occupational psychosis by including me. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people, and I do. So let me proceed. What I want to look at is the way in which new media begins to change how we deal with the world. My main provocative statement is that technological networks have reconfigured the globe. It does challenge the nation state, not in perhaps the same ways we think about, and I take Yascha's comments to heart that the nation state is not going away, but I would argue that in some ways it is no longer going to be the only or even the primary organizing principle of geopolitics. Just as we can't confuse weather for climate, so we can't confuse the elections of 2016 with long-term global trends. Political identity will be shaped, I think, more by your membership in networks than your geography. The fact that Donald Trump helped the Brexit campaign as well as Barack Obama tried to prevent it shows the network, the internet working here. And finally, because I'm a media guy, the overwhelming importance of media means that narratives overwhelm policy. And what I mean by that is we like to think of diplomacy as reasoned discourse, thinking through our common goals, our common ends, and working together to move forward. But one of the things we find is that networks or narratives are becoming far, far more powerful. I've got this quote from Hillary Clinton that tries to get at the same kind of concept, but let me move on. The key thing to this slide is what I'm trying to develop, which is a media-centric theory of international relations. There are lots of ways of thinking about international relations. You've got constructivists, you've got realists, you've got all kinds of people like that. But here's my occupational psychosis. I'm a media guy, so I think, no, it's really all about media. And what this means is there are two types of power. I know I'm in Boston, the home of Joe Nye, and so I'm supposed to say good things about soft power. I actually hate the concept of soft power because as a social scientist, I can't quantify it. I can't measure it. But so what I'm proposing are two types of power that actually get at some of the same things, but you can conceptualize. One is your network power. Where are you in the network? Are you part of a powerful network, or are you part of an unpowerful network? 2 years ago, ISIL showed itself to be a very powerful network. Now we're rolling back the network side. It's not just a matter of physical geography that ISIL controls, it's the network, and we've been constantly trying to disrupt those networks. And secondly, the power of narrative. This has become tremendously important, especially in the last 18 months. I do a lot of consulting work with the Department of Defense, and I can't tell you how many position papers and policy papers I see coming out of the Pentagon now about the role of narratives and how we shape those and how those shape us. I take as a way of thinking about how do we exercise that power, I take clues from the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells, who wrote a fascinating book several years ago called Communication Power, in which he argues that the two mechanisms of power nowadays are what he calls switching, or building networks, or unbuilding networks, switching in, switching out. Those of you old enough to remember a network switch or even a telephone network exchange might realize what that means. You take people out of the network, and so can you cut off those networks? The movement of ICON away from the U.S. Department of Commerce last year was one of the ways in which this is demonstrated. And then finally, programming or reprogramming. So Castells uses these two technological metaphors to argue for a new type of geopolitics, a new type of geopolitical understanding. I apologize, I'm rushing here. I've got a series of maps I'd like you to pay attention to. I'm going to run through these. And what I'd like for you to see is, what do you see in common between all of these maps? These are major global shipping trade routes for 100 years from 1750 to 1850 between the Dutch, the British, and the Spanish. The next map is major telegraph lines from 1891. You can barely see them, but you see the red lines. The next map shows you British undersea cables in 1901. What do you see so far? What I hope you see is that it's the same places that are always connected. So from the technology of shipping, which was a transportation technology for hundreds of years, when we built new electronic networks, what did we do? We reinforced the existing networks. We reinforced the existing structures. We built upon what we already had. We didn't really extend to many new places. Now, the Network Society from 2006. This shows total bandwidth in the year 2006. What do you see? You see 300 years later, we're laying out bandwidth the same place that we were sailing between several years ago. And then finally, the last map, the world looks like, oh, that's not it. So, oh yeah, this is it. This is what we like to think the world looks like, but I would argue, no, that's actually much more. This is actually a scan of IP version 4, IPv4 DNS addresses. And what do you see? Who's connected? Who's still in touch with one another? We see for 400 years, 500 years, I think you could even track it back a little bit further, you see the same places connected by new technology. So even as our communication technologies become more robust, much more powerful, we can do far better things, and we could even grow them in so many significant ways. We tend to reinforce the existing structures. But because our society has been reconfigured, and I use that word very deliberately, it has been reconfigured. I mean, this is a revolutionary thing. It's not an evolutionary thing. It has reconfigured how we think about society. As a result, the distances, the economic, the political, the cultural distances between places are actually increasing rather than decreasing. The myth of globalization is that it was going to flatten everybody out, and in fact that didn't happen. What we see is actually greater inequities arising around the world. The app gap, or why platforms matter. Those of you who are a fan of Lord of the Rings will recognize this image. Since I'm a PC user, I just like to throw the Apple logo in there. My argument, though, is that apps or platforms are displacing the web, what we think of as the internet, because of their unique communicative capacity. Platforms are becoming a form of communicative capital. They are the platforms by which we engage one another. They are how we engage on networks. They are how we show our status. And they are how we gain access to certain other networks. So just look at somebody's LinkedIn profile sometime and you'll see what I mean. Moreover, platform dominance means global dominance. Let me illustrate that a little bit further. These are the number of users by, the internet users by language. So you see that English users are barely a majority of global internet users, Chinese, a close second, Spanish, Japanese further down. But look at the next chart. Internet content by language is overwhelmingly in English. Chinese, which is the second largest number of users, constitutes only about 4% of internet content. What does that mean? Well, let's get at it. I would argue that we're seeing the emergence of a new bipolar world, defined not by ideology, nor by geography, but by which platforms you're on. And so if you look at this chart of the most dominant social media platforms or apps, Facebook, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, all owned by one U.S. company, dominate the world, followed by 3 Chinese platforms, then Instagram, Tumblr. With my graduate students, we're doing a lot of research on WeChat and Weixin in Chinese, and WeChat is the killer app, and it's astounding what you can do with WeChat in China. As a matter of fact, you can buy a hamburger in Burger King with WeChat. It's astounding what you can do with it. And I read an article today that came out 3 days ago looking for the next English version of WeChat. So this is going to be the next thing. But it's an incredibly powerful network. But what we see is we see 2 different internets emerge. Now this was the whole debate over ICON, is we don't want different networks to emerge. We want to keep it one internet, one global free network. But in fact, that's not what's happened. What we see is the emergence of 2 separate worlds defined by communication platform, not defined by ideology. Apps don't have borders, do they? Right? So if you think about it, this is just Twitter, and you see where their users are coming from, and I'm just racing through this. And look at the dominance of Facebook around the world. But again, you see over in Russia, you see vKontakte has taken over, and then the Qzone and WeChat in China. So we really are seeing the emergence of different worlds. What does it mean? This is from a feature that Facebook provided several years ago. They don't update it anymore, but this is what's called Facebook Friends. What this allows you to do is to track relationships, Facebook friendships across national boundaries. And so this is, of course, the United States. You see our biggest friends are Canada, Mexico, Dominican Republic, and the UK. Now, what do you see there? You see language characteristics, right? You see some probably familial. You see migration patterns happening there. And so you see those connections. Here's Russia's Facebook friendships. Now, I realize not many people use Facebook in Russia anymore, especially since Vkontakte has taken over. But you still see the same kinds of connections that emerge. Here's Iran's. You see their networks, where their networks emerge. And then finally, China. China isn't on here. Now, China's not on here for two reasons. Number one, Facebook is technically banned in China, although that doesn't stop any Chinese who come to the United States immediately opening a Facebook account, nor people in China who really want to, they can log on to Facebook. It really has to do with the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has been trying to get China to open up for many years to Facebook, and he didn't want to tick them off by putting them on this deal. So he didn't want to show where they are. So this just is Hong Kong, and you see the kinds of relationships that emerge. And China is literally excluded. So what does this mean? It means that the world that we are in is a little bit different. And I'll just finish with this. Network society, the emergence of a network society, and by which I mean a society that has been defined, I think I'm almost out of town, a society that is defined by its technological networks makes us rethink our issues of political identity. Our national interest, what is in our national interest, and finally, what is our global influence? How do we think about that? My argument is that global power and economic relationships are likely to be grossly inequitable in both network power and narrative power. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kluver. Next, we'll have Benjamin Sachs speaking. Benjamin Sachs is a PhD candidate from Princeton University studying geographic history and its implications for urban history, colonialism, and empire. Mr. Sachs is writing his dissertation on the colonial city and the implications of geography and development for social hierarchies. Today, Mr. Sachs will discuss geography, boundaries, and borders in the future of the nation-state with an emphasis on physical geography.
Great, thank you very much. Okay. Great, thank you. Is this going to be high enough for me? Okay. I'll just begin by asking, can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. To begin with, I just want to thank EPIIC for inviting me back to Tufts. I'm enormously appreciative to be back. I'd also like to begin by actually discussing a word that has been, I think, an elephant in the room for the last 24 hours, which is geography. We've heard it discussed in various forms and various ways. And each person who's gotten up, and there are many individuals here who are far more experienced than I am, who have gone up and they've discussed their particular mold of geography. Now this is because geography is critical. It's critical to understanding policymaking, it's critical to understanding why the world the way it is, and it's critical to understanding where we're going. And not to sound too much like the National Geographic Society, but it's important for us to know where we're going by watching the world around us. There is a problem, however, and that is most Americans actually have a very primitive understanding of geographic knowledge and geospatial knowledge, or what we could loosely call geostrategy. I've described this variously as the geography dilemma, the fact that we are, at least in theory, supposed to be the world's policemen and run a lot of the world's international affairs or manage it financially and politically and militarily, yet most Americans actually have a demonstrably limited capacity of geographic understanding. Now, it's not Americans' fault, really. It's because of structural problems that were taken care of at the government level as early as the 1950s. When the Cold War really came up in the post-war environment, we switched due to pressure from various forces to area studies and to quantitative political science, and geography went out the window. This was not the case in many other countries, including our NATO partners, and perhaps more importantly, in places like Russia, where geography remains a critical study. Now, of course, there's another exception to this, or several exceptions. In the military academies, of which there's so many cadets here today, geography is still quite an important discipline to study, physical geography, geostrategy, and so on. So today, I want to discuss about one particular aspect. I'm going to try and do a broad cover in 10-15 minutes, and then we can talk more about specifics in the Q&A. I want to discuss about borders in the future of the nation state. So I'll begin by citing two quotes that we've heard about a lot recently. Our current president said to an audience a few weeks ago that a nation is not a nation without a border. I don't know what that means. My sense is, without being too political, as he doesn't either, but that's because if you look at most definitions, geographical, official geographical, so those put out by the American Association of Geographers, the Geographic Board, the CIA, or their counterparts in Britain, we don't actually use the term precise borders in our definition of the nation state. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, or the Webster, sort of the America's National Dictionary, you'll find the same conundrum. They'll say borders, generally defined borders, but the key word there is generally. So what I'd like to propose, and as mostly trained as a historian, so I'm going to be pulling from history for this, is that borders actually allow, both in a legal and a historical sense, for a little bit of wiggle room. There's a wobble there. When you go off of that wobble, when you're actually trying to specify the border, when you try to impose a rigidity into the system, that's where tension builds and finally results in conflict. It is very difficult to measure the range of wobble, what is a permissible sort of generalization of a border. But the key is that I want to define borders as when a strategic majority of actors involved in a particular landmass or national divide recognize a border, however it may be construed. And I'll go and discuss that in a moment. And agree amongst themselves that those are generally to be the borders. Now, they can recognize this in many different ways. They can recognize it through international mediation, bilateral negotiation, treaties. They can, more often than not, simply recognize it by preferring to have a stalemate or simply ignoring it for a very long time. Now, why would they ignore a border? Well, the reason is national pride. And this gets to a central point about borders throughout history. The precise border is less important than the perception of a border, which is why President Trump made the comments he did. He's by no means the first person to make this assessment. So how many here know Andy Borowitz's work in The New Yorker? Okay, great, most of you. So as with most sharp satirists, a lot of what Borowitz says is actually grounded in truth. So on August 21st, 2015, he wrote an article that declared that voters who favor this border cannot identify the border on the map. The more enthusiastic voters are about building a wall, citing a non-existent poll, the less likely they are to know where the border is actually situated. Voters who could not correctly identify the U.S.-Mexico border provided no fewer than 15 alternative borders. 20% of the respondents said the U.S.-Mexico border was actually along the U.S.-Canadian border. Now, the scary part of this is that despite his humorous point, there have been a number of polls that have been conducted by various universities and agencies over the years, most notably a 2014 one by the Washington Post that corroborate this assessment. There was a 2014 poll, for instance, that said the less that Americans knew about geography and borders of a country, the more likely, in this case, you could to intervene. That's not a very good policy decision. Now, the problem with this is that historically borders have actually defined accurate, precise borders have meant relatively little for empires. In fact, as Charles Mayers demonstrated, the Ottoman Empire in much of the early modern period actually didn't want to have precisely defined borders because they saw it as a sign of weakness. Sort of if we borrow sort of a Paul Kennedy assessment of the rise and fall as sort of pyramid of great power, which is controversial to this day, the Ottoman Empire saw defining its border as an endpoint, the beginning of the end. Similarly, the British Empire had a hesitation about defining boundaries. When it was pushed to, even as late as the 20th century, it had to. But more often than not, the British preferred to come to an understanding with the French or the Spanish or the Dutch or any other rival imperial power to have sort of a gray area, to have what we would see today perhaps as a demilitarized zone such as we see in Korea. So again, borders come in many shapes and sizes. A more recent example is the U.S.-Mexican border. Now, the U.S.-Mexican border is, in our lifetimes, it's secure, well, it's mostly secure. It's defined on a map. But in reality, that type of border remains relatively rare in the world. If we look at Saudi Arabia and its neighboring countries, They didn't even decide to define the border until about 1991. Why? Almost no one lives in the Rub al-Khali, or no man's land in Arabic, and until the 1990s, strategically, they had little interest in defining boundaries. Now, we could go into the history, this precise history of why this took place, but the important thing to remember at this point is that these countries, by and large, operated as constituent sovereign states with an integrity that was recognized by most other states without having precisely defined boundaries. The issue is, such as we see in the Middle East today, or we see in Ukraine, is when that wiggle room is trespassed, when the deviation is pushed too far, then we end up with a situation such as we see in Luhansk and Donetsk. The reason was because Russia, or sorry, I should say rebels, and possibly backed by the Russians, the rebels threatened by trying to adjust and change the Ukrainian boundaries, they threatened the integrity or the survival or the future of Ukraine as a sovereign state. Now, there have been political scientists and international observers who have said that if all the parties were to have gone to the diplomatic table early on, then obviously perhaps this could have been avoided and there wouldn't have been any gunfire. That's the past. So I want to show some different types of boundaries. First off, as history has demonstrated, boundaries are not just geographical, they're not just political. Boundaries take on many, many turns. They can mean many things. Most of us today, myself included, tend to look at borders as one or two or three-dimensional, but most borders aren't. So my area of expertise historically has been in Britain and in the Commonwealth, so I'm going to discuss some British examples in recent history, and then I'll end my discussion with a brief discussion about the future. So you see certain borders on this satellite image from Google Earth of the South Atlantic. You see borders here. We have recognized international borders. You see the Mercosur states, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile. We see Tierra del Fuego, we see the Falkland Islands, and we see part of Antarctica. But there are other borders, ones that most of us, most of the time, even those who are sitting at places like Tufts, don't recognize, that are still just as important when you're thinking about geopolitics. We have a continental shelf, which under international maritime law is also used to define the nation state, as much so as a land border. But it's also just as contentious. We also have zones of influence, which have been around as long as there have been empires, these borderlands, these frontiers that Stephen Aaron and Jeremy Edelman have discussed, at least in the historical profession, for the last 20 years. And again, in the Q&A, we can discuss that in a more focused way. Right here, I see a zone of influence, two competing zones of influence. I see Argentina's zone of influence based on physical geography and based on the continental shelf. And I see a British sphere of influence, what Klaus Dobbs has referred to as the pink empire of ice, which stretches down from beyond the top of the map from Ascension Island and St. Helena down through the Falkland Islands and into the peninsula of Antarctica. The 1982 Falklands War, in many ways, was a clash over this border, this unseen border. And in fact, the sinking of ships and so on, the loss of lives, was over borders that were discongruous and were difficult to understand. There's another type of border I'd like to show. This is a wavelength of the 7,000 to 8,000 kilohertz range on the shortwave radio spectrum. The only way you can see the radio waves is by using what's known as a waterfall. So for those of you, again, in the military, you'll probably be familiar with a radio waterfall. But again, for most of us in the history and humanities, this is quite new. Well, I see borders here. The top one, it should be at roughly 12,095 kilohertz. Since the 1950s, that frequency has been controlled by the British government. If anyone tries to go near that frequency with their transmitter, they can go to the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, and protest it legally. And the likelihood is they'll win. They've done it before. The ITU is an international body backed by the United Nations, and it's recognized as official in international law, so it's a boundary. Down here, which is perhaps a bit more alarming, is an image of the 7,000 to 8,000 kilohertz spectrum in almost its entirety. Nearly every frequency that's highlighted there is owned by China. Now, China has been aggressively purchasing wavelengths and wave bands in the last 15 years, particularly as Russia has exited the shortwave business after they closed the Voice of Russia World Service and turned its money over to Sputnik, the new sort of combined media agency. Most of this is pointed to Africa and to South Asia in order to augment and enhance China's swiftly growing influence in these developing countries. This too is a boundary. Almost no one can transmit in the 7,000 to 8,000 kilohertz range anymore. When they do, they're overwhelmed by the sheer transmission power. Another factor is that these transmitters are located in different spots throughout the world, at sites called relay stations, further augmenting China's authority. So what we see, to summarize, is borders and boundaries not conceived by one or two or three, but by to the nth dimension. So this leads me to my final point about the future of the nation state. Now I agree, and I think it's quite open contention, that the nation state is going to change, but it's going to look very similar for at least the next century. But rather than looking at and worrying about whether migrants are crossing legally or illegally across the southern U.S.-Mexico border, we need to be considerably more cognizant of that nth dimension. The fact that borders for the United States and for other countries means many, many different things. And if our interests are consumed with renegotiating the U.S.-Mexico border, the U.S.-Canadian border, these physical borders, or the perception of having a strong border, whether or not fences are actually effective. We can cite the Berlin Wall as an example where it was perhaps not entirely effective, in fact, counterproductive in the long run. When in fact we actually have other borders that are being assailed and attacked and are being tested by rival powers, such as cyber warfare or rival broadcasting, in which case our allies do the same, play the same tricks that we do, and so on. So my final point is to remind everyone here that in our generation, the generation that follows us, our children, that we need to be very sensitive and aware of what the term borders actually means, and the fact that it can take on many definitions, and it has that wobble. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Dr. Michael Bröning, the head of the International Policy Department of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, a political foundation affiliated to the Social Democratic Party of Germany. He is the founding editor of the International Politics and Society, a political magazine with a monthly readership of 200,000. He will be discussing the rise of populism in Europe in conversation with issues of migration and what the established political system can or should do to respond.
Well, thanks very much. Does this work?
I believe so. If you move it closer.
Can I use yours?
You can use mine.
Okay, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You all know that these are great days for Europe's populists. I mean, as we speak, they are basically popping the champagne. And that's why I would like to use my time here to talk about the challenge of populism in Europe. My key point basically is that there's no one populist challenge in Europe, but there are several. And that's because populism isn't so much an ideology, but it's an approach to politics. Populism isn't like socialism. It's not like nationalism. It's not like communism or fascism. It's not a fixed set of beliefs, but it's an approach towards politics. And in many ways, and I think that it's key to understand that it's a response to a perceived failure of established political parties to address some problems that are out there. So what will I talk about? I would like to first update you on what's happening in Europe these days. And basically I want to show you how severe the challenge really is for political parties, for established political parties, I should say, in Europe. And then I would like to briefly look at what fuels this populist rage in Europe. And in particular, I would like to take a look at Germany, because I think that the case of Germany holds some interesting lessons for us. So let me start with some context. The next 12 months will be decisive in Europe because, you know, the European community was founded by 6 countries. It's the predecessor to the European Union, and we'll see elections in 4 out of these 6 countries. And once these elections in Europe this year are over, we might wake up in a very, very different Europe. Why is that? Because in all these elections that are coming up, the political fringes are expected to make some very significant gains. In the Netherlands, as we speak, the right-wing populist Geert Wilders and his Freedom Party are topping the polls. They're the strongest party according to the polls. The same is happening in France with Marine Le Pen and her Front National. She will for sure emerge as the strongest candidate in the first round of elections. And pollsters yesterday gave her a 44% chance of actually winning the second round as well. When you look at Italy, it's a similar picture. Italy is often overlooked, unrightly so, because it's on many regards it's the most populist country in Europe. They have more than one populist movement, so they have at least 3 populist parties, and when you add them all up, then they already have more than 50% electoral support. And then, of course, in Germany, we have the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany. It's a relatively new right-wing populist party, and they are expected to enter parliament in elections in September, and it's the first time in recent German history that a right-wing populist party will actually be elected to the national parliament. And of course, these things are happening against the backdrop of populist parties, right-wing populist parties already governing in Europe. In Hungary, in Poland, we have right-wing governments. Right-wing populist parties are also in coalition agreements in other places, such as in Norway. They are backing governments, for example, in Denmark. So that's on the right. And then, of course, on the left, mainly in southern Europe, we have left-wing populist parties. Spain had a whole set of elections in the last year, and the left-wing populist Podemos party did exceptionally well. And of course, Greece is governed by a left-wing populist party, Syriza, in a curious coalition agreement with a right-wing populist party. So the ends really meet in Greece. So that's the general picture in Europe. And I'm absolutely biased because I'm affiliated to the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which is the center-left party, but to me it's not a pretty picture at all. So the question is, what fuels these populist movements? And I think one thing that we have to understand is that this populist rage in Europe is certainly part of a global trend. It's not something that's only happening in Europe, as you know, since we're sitting in Boston. But it's not only happening in the US, it's also happening, Yascha mentioned it, it's happening in India with Hindu nationalism. We see the emergence of ethnic nationalism in China, in Japan. We see a global return of religion, really, with Pentecostalist movements in Western Africa, with the return of political Islam. We see an increased role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. So that's part of the picture as well. And the reasons for this are, of course, very complex, and certainly a combination of things. But I think that technical developments are really at the core. We're talking about the shrinking of space, the disappearance of geography, and an increased really exposure to difference on an individual level that's really unprecedented. And we have changing media patterns, the social media echo chamber, the filter bubble, and we have the weakening as a result of that of traditional intermediaries, such as political parties, such as the established medias, that have really been largely sidelined in many places in Europe. And last but not least, of course, we have a global redistribution of production, and we've talked about that yesterday. We have a new global deal, which has been very good for the middle classes in India and China, but it hasn't been a good deal at all for the middle classes in Europe. So that's really just in a few keywords, the global trends. And I would like to see how that played out in specific cases in elections in Europe. In the last year, in 2016, we had 14 elections in the European Union, 14. From presidential elections in Bulgaria to German state-level elections. And in many of these cases, really these elections were about migration and politics of identity. For example, in Austria, in Germany, we had a Hungarian referendum on migration, we had the Brexit vote, and really all these elections were ultimately about the question of who is us and who is them. And it was very much the defining issue for voters and for the political parties who ran in these elections. And in some countries in Europe, this has been going on for some time. When you look at the case of Denmark, and you look at the last 5 elections that have been taken place in Denmark, 4 of these last 5 elections were decided on migration issues. Now in other places, that's not the case at all. When you look at elections in Spain, that wasn't about migration at all. It was about austerity, and rightly so when you have a youth unemployment beyond 25%. So when you look at these elections, and also maybe think about the referendum in Italy, which also wasn't about migration, it was about basically the la casta, the corruption of the political class, you just see that populists really address more than one issue. It's not a single issue movement, and they have really benefited, but they have all benefited for different reasons. But while the reasons are different, the pattern that lies behind their success is really the same. Because wherever the populists in Europe have been successful, they've been successful because they've addressed questions that the established parties have either failed to address or that the established parties have failed to address in a compelling and convincing manner. So in other words, you could say that the success of the populists is really the failure of the established parties to deal with the issues that are out there. Now you might say, well, isn't this obvious? And in a way, I would say, yes, it is obvious, but not when you talk to European decision makers, at least some of them, because when you do that and you ask them what should we do, there's usually a pattern of two responses, what we should do about it. And the first pattern is, well, we just need to explain our wise policy better, you know? What we do is really without alternative, and if we can just explain to the people why we do this and that there's really no alternative, then they will come to their senses. So that's response category number one. And then there's response category number two, which is, well, you know, there's these reckless demagogues and they are seducing our gullible public, and if only these evil leaders with their incitement of hatred would go away, then the problem would go away. And that's why we have to shun them, and we have to shame them, and we have to silence them. And I'm not saying that in some cases that's not necessary. I mean, clearly in some cases that would be necessary. But when you talk about 50% of people voting for certain political parties, it's clear to me that this goes beyond a communication problem. So how have political parties failed their voters? And this is where I would like to look at the case of Germany, and I would also like to be a bit of self-critical here. Now, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, is really not the strongest populist party in Europe. But it's an interesting case because Germany has long been considered a country that's really out of reach for right-wing populist parties because of Germany's history of fascism and neo-Nazism. So right now, AfD stands between 8 to 15%, but in East Germany, they have really established themselves as the second biggest party. So in large parts of Eastern Germany, they are the second biggest party. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because the AfD offered alternatives where established parties time and again insisted on this Thatcherite notion that there is no alternative, you know, Tina. So AfD was founded in 2013, and you know that was the height of the Euro crisis, and there were, you might remember that, there were like nightly sessions of Europe's leaders negotiating over bailout deals. You know, millions and billions of euros were bargained over, but there wasn't really any public debate. I mean, the German Bundestag, the parliament, didn't have a controversial debate about it. The cabinet in Germany didn't have a debate about it. And why didn't they? Because the two parties in power, the Christian Democrats and my own political parties, agreed on the cause, because there's no alternative. And there was only one party that actually countered this, and that was the AfD. Of course, they called for kicking out the Greeks out of the Eurozone, and you know, with this stance, overnight, they received 4.5% public support. Now, interestingly, when the Euro crisis left the headlines at the end of 2013, also AfD largely disappeared, and their support went down to 3%. Then came along the summer of 2015 and the refugee crisis in Europe, and Angela Merkel's decision to basically open the borders, and approximately 1 million refugees were taken into Germany. And again, there was a wide political consensus. There wasn't a controversial vote in Parliament about this. There wasn't a debate in the cabinet about this. And there wasn't a controversial debate in the media. But while there was a political consensus about this question, there wasn't a social consensus about this question. Even back in 2015, when you look at opinion polls, the polls are very clear that the population was basically split 50-50 in favor and against. And there was again, well, there was some rumbling in Bavaria with the Christian, with Merkel's coalition partner, but there was only really one fundamental opposition to this cause, which was again the AfD. And of course, they called for a closing of the borders, if necessary, by the use of force. And with this, they went up from 3% to double-digit support. And then in 2016, with a wave of violence and terrorism that was committed in parts by refugees from Muslim countries, they again benefited from a stance that, well, Germany really has to say no to political Islam, and basically declaring that Islam does not belong to Germany. So basically, AfD shifted shape 3 times. They were founded as this anti-Euro party, then they became this anti-immigration party, and then they became this anti-Islam party. And in doing so, they filled a vacuum, a political vacuum that was left behind by the notion of TINA, of there is no alternative, by the established parties, because they basically moved to the center. Merkel shifted to the left on migration issues, and the Social Democrats, my party, shifted to the right by backing austerity policies in Europe, and that explains why many voters were really just left without a political home. And that was particularly painful for the center left, not only in Europe, not only in Germany, but really in Europe as a whole, because it's the workers in Europe that have turned their backs on the workers' parties. When you look at the numbers, it's very painful for center-left parties, because in Austria in the last elections, 85% of workers voted for the right-wing populist party. And in France, we know that only 30% of voters right now support the Parti Socialiste. And in the 70s, that was 80%. So the challenge is really, how do parties on the left reconnect with their voters? And it's very difficult for us as center-left parties to discuss these issues of identity, because we effectively, we don't really have traditionally we don't have the toolkit to discuss these questions of identity. You know, Social Democrats, we like to talk about redistribution, we like to talk about the minimum wage, you know, it's all this Marxist sort of theory about, you know, the social existence determines consciousness, and we like to talk about the mode of production and the minimum wage and justice, equality, and this is all important and it's all fine. But we don't have the vocabulary to discuss really identity issues, especially related to migration. And I think that that's why we are currently struggling to really reconnect to our former voters, the traditional blue-collar voters. But it's also clear that we have to reconnect to them. So to sum it up, first I would say that there's not one, but there are several populist challenges in Europe. Second, I think it's important to understand that these populist challenges are the result of very real existing grievances, and they are not a problem of communication. And third, I would say that when you preach that there is no alternative, TINA, for too long, then you ultimately get a party that calls itself the alternative, whether you like it or not. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. To conclude, I'd like to ask my friend Min to introduce Farah Pandith.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? All right. So, order and chaos, the two opposing forces that are contesting for influence in the contemporary world. In order to achieve orders in the face of terrorism, dispute, poverty, and many other forces of chaos, we need guidance, programs that can help us understand this world and to solve the world's problems. That is how I would characterize the Benison Public Diplomacy Initiative. Designed to bring global policymakers and officials to task, the initiative is dedicated to create a conducive environment in the search for common ground. It has brought policymakers and officials together to share experience in many programs such as Iraq moving forward. Following that spirit, the Institute for Global Leadership established the Robert and Joanne Benison Public Diplomacy Award as part of the Benison's Public Diplomacy Initiative. The award was created to recognize distinguished public officials, intellectuals, and individuals, people who have dedicated themselves to bring about reconciliations in the face of animosities, people who have spent their entire lives fighting inequities and inequities in the face of poverty and oppressions, people like Farah Pandith. Farah Pandith is an expert in the field of countering violent extremism, both within and outside the administrations. She's no stranger to this place, having received the master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a bachelor's degree in government and psychology from Smith College. He has been a dedicated public servant, serving 3 U.S. presidents. She currently serves on the Homeland Security Advisory Councils. Ms. Pandith has worked as the U.S. AID, the National Security Council, and the U.S. State Department. Now, in 2019, she was appointed as the first ever special representative to the Muslim communities. Now, outside of the government, she's writing a book on how we will win against groups like ISIS. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11, she convinced her boss to help her quit her job so that she could go to DC and serve her nations. Throughout her life, Ms. Pandith has traveled to nearly 100 countries and launched numerous youth initiatives. Her approach has always been that of engagement, understanding, and sympathy. Thanks to these selfless devotions, in January 2013, she was awarded the Secretary Distinguished Honor Award for exceptionally outstanding service to the agencies of the U.S. government, resulting in achievements of marked national or international significance. Ms. Pandith has also received numerous honors for her work in public service and was named one of the most 100 powerful women by Washingtonian magazine. And now, it is my pleasure to present her next award, the Robert and Joanne Penderson Public Diplomacy Award. I'd like to invite Ms. Pandith to the stage to receive the award, and Mr. Robert Penderson to present the award.
You are very sweet. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. You're so kind. Really, I am humbled. Thank you. This is beautiful. Okay.
Perhaps you should.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
Yes.
Oops. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Tony, come on up.
Yes, I would.
Yes.
Good idea. No. Come
Yes.
here. Stay in the picture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm so, thank you. Can I keep this here as I do my? Yes, thank you. Okay.
Right.
That was a surprise. Just
Ms. Pandith will now be speaking on the crisis of identity with Muslim youth and why it is important to foreign policy. Thank you, Ms. Pandith, and
Okay,
congratulations.
I was not expecting that. You're not allowed to do things like that before I go forward. Thank you. I'm really humbled, and it means a lot to me to be sitting in this auditorium getting that award. Thank you. I remember sitting in a chair up there in the fall of 1993 and thinking, as I looked at my Fletcher first class students, as the dean was talking about all these great things that everybody in the class had done, I remember thinking, sitting over there, they made a huge mistake. I am not supposed to be here. So every time I come to ASEAN, I always have that tape that goes back in my mind. I have really enjoyed hearing from all of you today. And in fact, the things that I want to talk about today hit each of your topics. So I hope that I can get through my 12 minutes and then we can have a nice conversation. I wanted to ask you all why Muslims matter. And what is a Muslim? And what does it mean to be Muslim, and what's Muslim identity? Those are questions that the most senior government people around the world are asking, policymakers, both at places like the State Department as well as the Department of Defense. And it's a squishy, soft power question. What is identity anyway, and why should we care as foreign policymakers? Well, we should care because of 9/11. And on that day, when our country was attacked and nearly 3,000 people died from all over the world, everybody sort of questioned what this non-state actor, this terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, was all about. What was the narrative that they were using to lure in young people to have them join their side? The narrative they used was a narrative of us and them. And that narrative has been used in many different ways in the last almost 16 years since 9/11. But it specifically connects to the thing that I've been working on over the course of my professional career in the both Bush and Obama administrations around Muslims. The fact that our country had somebody who was called the special representative to Muslim communities should make you scratch your head. But we needed to do that, and why? Because we needed to connect with 1/4 of humanity. 1/4 of humanity is Muslim, and that's why you guys should care. So let me talk to you about this squishy, soft power thing, this ideological landscape that I've had to navigate over the course of the last years since 9/11, and I hope to convince you that in fact it is not just a squishy thing, but it's actually really important to what our current president is talking about in terms of defeating ISIS. When I started working on this issue, there wasn't something called ISIS. We were looking at the group called AQ, and we were thinking that we were going to be able to contain it through hard power. When I was asked to go into Europe in 2007 to start speaking to Muslim communities in Europe, the State Department was really confused. Why are we talking to Muslims in Europe in 2007? Because this guy named Geert Wilders was out there going to do this thing with the Quran. He was going to burn it. There was a film called Fitna. A couple of years before, there was the Danish cartoon crisis, and that's why we were focused on what was happening with Muslim youth. Now, most of the State Department didn't really think this was a big deal. To be absolutely honest with you, we thought that it was sort of a thing that was going to happen, and it would pass. What we learned through our navigation of talking to thousands of young Muslims across Europe was that something really weird was going on with the connectivity about identity for young people under the age of 30. Not only were they digital natives, and you guys all know what that means, but they were asking questions about what it meant to be modern and Muslim, and how you could be a Muslim in a Western environment and actually be true to yourself. And they were getting answers from a source that I call Sheikh Google. Okay? So instead of going to their mom and dad, instead of going to their families, they were going online like the underwear bomber and asking questions like, why doesn't my family eat halal meat? And as we began to understand that there was a crisis of identity and people were really keen on finding out how to be Muslim, we were obviously asking the question, why are they asking this question? Why is this so prevalent? Well, it's so prevalent because AQ wanted you to believe that there was only one way to be Muslim, and that was their way. And so if you're confused about what it means to be Muslim, the title of the panel is Identity and Integration, and if you don't feel integrated, whatever that might mean, come over to us and we'll tell you how to be Muslim. So this complexity of navigation around these issues of identity were really important for us, and we began to learn things. No matter where in Europe I went, as I talked to Muslims, whether I was in Spain, if I was in Italy, whether I was talking to a first generation or a third generation, whether I was talking to a Muslim in Europe who had been part of a country that was a colonizer or was not a colonizer, all the Muslim youth were asking the question, what does it mean to be Muslim? We began to understand that the only way to be able to stop the ideology that was coming in from AQ and other sources like that was obviously to present a counter-narrative that was going to make sense to the young people, and that counter-narrative came from Muslims themselves, influencers, as we would call them, people that made sense for them, not necessarily for us. Now, the third part of the title of this panel is nation state, and what I'm talking about are non-nation state things. We're talking about a borderless community because ideas don't have borders, and you can't build an idea wall. What we were talking about is a field that we call countering violent extremism. Populating out in the world today is a lot of misinformation, if you would permit me to use that terminology, about what CVE is. And I want to tell you that it's the war of ideas. It's how you compete with the bad guys in a natural, local level by influencers that make sense for that community. By the time Obama became president, it was very clear that we had to do far more to engage with Muslims. And he pivoted in a bigger way through his Cairo speech to talk about engaging with Muslims based on mutual interest and mutual respect. At that point, we began to see connectivity around this ideological dimension, this idea of this crisis of identity globally. And that's where all of you come in. Because this room that I'm looking at right now is not just European, obviously, and it's not just American. It is a multinational force, if you will, of civilians and non-civilians that are looking at a threat that's facing all of us here in the homeland and around the world. Because Muslims are having a crisis of identity, because they're asking questions about what it means to be modern and Muslim, and the most available answers are coming from the bad guys, you need to care. And what we've seen our country position itself to do, and other countries around the world, is to get into this ideological war in a way that we can populate with new alternatives so these young people find a meaning and belonging in this borderless world, right? They're connecting, and I so enjoyed what you had to say, and you had to say about the platforms and about what it means to be living with people that you only talk to because they are like you. What does it mean to understand what it means to be Muslim because foreigners are coming in and telling you you're not doing it the right way, you need to do it our way? What does it mean for you? I don't know if anybody in here is from the Maldives, but why should it matter to you? Why? Because the Maldives is 800 years of Islam. It is 100% Muslim. And if Maldivian youth are asking questions about what it means to be Muslim, you better ask why. And they're asking the question because foreign ideologies are coming into the Maldives just the way they're coming into our country. So I've seen a connectivity of confusion around an us and them around the world. I've seen the power of the borderless state of ideology, and I've seen how important nation states and non-state actors need to be in the issue of identity. Now, as I think about how we have to think about what we need to do, I look back at the National Security Strategy of 2006, and I urge you all to go back and read it, that we have to fight this battle with a battle of arms and a battle of ideas. And as we look at the Trump era, because you asked me to get into the Trump piece of this, I want you to think about language. You ended what you had to say around what words matter and how you hear things. For our nation's history, starting with George Washington all the way until Barack Obama, every American president has spoken about Islam with dignity. I know this because I've gone back and I've looked at the words of every single American president. When you have a president of the United States that calls the religion of Islam an ideology, and when you don't give credibility to the idea that, in fact, the religion can actually be something that you can engage with through Muslims, you have another us and them that has been set up. And as I look at what the future is going to mean around groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, the Taliban, all of whom are different, but all of whom share this basic idea that they're going to tell you what it means to be Muslim, that they're going to say to you that being Muslim means that you're part of a monolith, that we're all the same, that diversity doesn't matter, that they're going to push back against what civil society is trying to say, which is Islam is diverse, there are many different kinds of Muslims around the world, culture matters, how we have lived and grown up as young Muslims matter, and then we need to celebrate it. As that's going forward and these terrorist organizations are moving forward, along the platform of the technology superhighway, we have a problem. Identity matters. It should matter to you about what these Muslims think about themselves. And whether you were born in the United States and you have been saturated with this idea of owning diversity and being part of a history in our country that is that allows freedom of faith, or you're part of a country that does not, we're seeing the same phenomenon take place. It terrifies me. Because as I said when I started, 1/4 of the planet is Muslim. 1.6 billion people are under the age of 30 that are Muslim. These are large numbers. Technology is just improving. The echo chambers of who you are and who you listen to are shrinking. The amplification of an us and them has gone beyond what anyone could ever imagine. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with something that I call open power. When we think about how to solve this problem, we used to think that it had to be around what government needed to do. We needed to get in there and develop counter-narratives and have government go out there and do that. Government's not credible. They're not the ones that Muslims want to hear from. Muslim kids want to hear from their peers, which means that we need to think about the role of civil society, and we need to think about the role of private sector. Two sectors that we have not actually talked about today in any real way, but I want to place on the table, because for us to be able to solve the crisis of identity for Muslims, it is going to require all of us across many different criteria to come together to open up the aperture and to figure out how we can produce, at scale, a wide variety of local counter-narratives that will appeal to Muslim youth, that help them understand how to be modern and Muslim, and how to push back against the idea that in order to be Muslim, you have to do what the bad guys want you to do. So as we begin to think about all of these issues, I want to leave you with the points that I made, just so that you can know that you have a role to play. Identity matters, and you should be thinking about this in everything that you do in the world that you live in. How you talk about the other, how you think about diversity, how you stand up and represent yourself in your own home to begin with, and then outside of it, makes a difference to the way everybody interprets who they are. And that, for the first time, very clearly has affected our country in the last 33 days of this administration. You're seeing a movement in America that you haven't seen before. People are owning their own space. They're redefining what it means to be American. I would ask you to own that space too, and understand why that identity of who you are, not just the Muslim identity, matters, who we are as a country, who we are as a world. And then I'd say the second thing is that I know you said you didn't like soft power, and government doesn't either. It's a squishy, awful thing that you can't quantify. And so when you hear on Monday the rollout of the plan that is going to come out of Secretary Mattis's team to defeat ISIS, the thing that you should be looking at is what part of that strategy has the soft power element. Is it only a battle of arms, or is it a battle of ideas? And how much money is our government going to be putting in to the effort to stop the spread of an us and them ideology worldwide? And are we doing this at scale with the kind of actors at the grassroots that can make a difference? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Pandith. I really appreciated how Ms. Pandith's last comments brought together the comments of the panel as a whole. So if our panelists don't mind, I'm going to open it directly to audience questions, because I want to be able to continue this sort of synthesis. So come up, please introduce yourself, get directly to your question, and address your question to one or a few panelists, preferably not the whole panel. We'll start on the right.
Thank you. My name is George Filatov. I'm from Russia, from Russian Academy of Public Administration. First of all, thank you very much for all these presentations. They were very interesting. But I would like to ask about the question that, in my opinion, was a little bit touched, but I would like to make a little bit more conversation on this point. Speaking about identity, it's important to speak, I think, about also loyalty, speaking about nation state. And there is a term that I like very much, and I would like to know your opinion about it. It was proposed by Robert Cox about new medievalism. So he's speaking about that in our time there are a variety, variety of loyalties. So you can be loyal to your small community, for example, a region like Basque, Catalonia, or Quebec, for example, or you can be loyal, at the same time, you can be loyal to state, nation, or to your, religion community. And he uses this term qualifying because, for example, in Russia there is some, a small, not big, but a small group of, people who think that they are more loyal to European Europe than to Russian government, to Russia sometimes. And what I would like to know, whether what do you think about this term? Whether it describes the new situation, the situation when some people are more connected with the people from other countries, with this term, new medievalism, because medievalism wasn't so good in practice during that time. It's an open question for anyone who would like to make a small comment on it.
Well, to be honest, I find it difficult to operate with this concept of new medievalism when we talk about the concept of nationalism, because to me, nationalism is anything but a medieval concept. It's a very short answer, but I feel that, in many ways, nationalism is a response to the experience of feudalism and medievalism, and that's why it's sort of a, that's why I find it hard to really, without insulting Robert Cox, but I find it hard to operate with the term and the concept of nationalism, actually.
No. He means that our time is the end of the nation state, or it's going to end, and in place of it there will be some new medievalism when the nation state, the idea that you are loyal only to your state, and new medievalism, that you have a variant of loyalties to different institutions. To different
So just very briefly, I think that it's always been the case that people had multiple levels of identity. The interesting thing about medieval times in Europe was that there wasn't one primary sense of identity, right? So it's not that medieval era was special because people had multiple identities and other times they didn't. I think it's just an unchanging human trait that you have multiple identities. In the city-states of the ancient world, they had identities as members of a city-state, but often, for example, in Greece also as Hellenes, as members of a broader Hellenic race, as they've thought of it, but also as members of their family or clan. I think what's different now from the Middle Ages is that there is an identity that trumps other identities for most people, not for everybody, and I think it's important to realize, for example, some of the networks of religious extremism that go beyond the nation state and that actually turn against the nation state often. But for a vast majority of the people in a vast majority of the countries, no matter how many Facebook accounts they have and no matter how fuzzy we want to say borders are, the nation state is the primary level of identity. And when different levels of identity start to cut against each other, when some people say, look, be proud of your city, and other people say you should just think about your religion, most people in our world still say, no, I am first and foremost Russian or American or whatever. And I think an unwillingness to face up to that is going to lead us into all kinds of well-meaning but dangerous political directions.
And I'll just add very briefly, I agree with my colleagues on that. I would just add that, I would just add that the nation state historically really never did have that Westphalia moment that is often taught in intro to IR classes, that in fact it was very much a gradual development with no real start date, and that it is remarkable in its flexibility. I mean, it's difficult for us sitting right here today with so many issues in the world to see the nation state as anything but in decline, but it has shown remarkable flexibility over the last 400 or 500 years, and I think that there's going to be an elasticity that will permit it to survive, so that we will be still able to say we're American, we're Russian, we're British, and so on, well into our children's generation. But the nation state may take on different forms, but I think its integral structure will survive.
I'd just like to ask the people asking questions to be specific, get directly to your question, and ask it preferably to a specific panelist.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm from Trinity College Dublin. I'm studying conflict resolution and reconciliation, and I have a question about identity because, especially, I'm Danish-German, so I know how it's to find an identity. So, and identities have I think need to have a specific attention, especially in struggling with making peace, like with religion, culture, mixed marriages, and so on. So my question is, in the global world we live in today, I believe we need to define new identities for security and creating peace. However, I'm concerned that the iPhone or our mobile phones will replace our identity, like how we define our identity because of the threat of technology. So I wanted to ask, what do you think? Do you agree, or what threats there are, or do you have any ideas? I'm asking Dr. Penn this, is that right? Yeah.
Better to answer that, but thank you.
Or Mr. Kluber as well, yeah, because you're more the...
I'll just say something really brief, but I bet you have something far smarter than but I know. The one thing I will say to you is that the bad guys understand, obviously, how to use the iPhone or whatever device we're going to have to make you believe that you are connected to that identity. And the only way you can lure somebody in is one-on-one, right? You're not luring somebody in. So they've magnified that experience of ownership over identity. The so-called state that ISIS is claiming is a mover, it's a driver emotionally, and it's giving a sense of belonging. And so it's backed up by what they see, what they hear, what they feel from that piece of plastic.
Yes, go ahead.
I would also just like to add one sentence to that question, because it's a fascinating question, and it sort of also borders on what you said in your remark about the network. And I would sort of like to defend the notion of the nation state, because I feel that these networks are of course important and they gain importance, but the question is, will they pay our rent? Will they pay our pensions? And I doubt that.
Yeah.
And that's also why the nation state is important, because this is where our social security is organized, and this is also where our political participation is organized. You all know about the European Union, and I'm a fan of the European Union. I like the European Union, but as a citizen, I have control over the nation state. I can participate in European elections, but I know that the impact is rather limited, and where I can really send away a government that I dislike, that's on the national level. And so I feel when we look at the two key issues for our personal security, it's a nation state that offers A, the security, and B, the level playing field in which we can operate and gain control. And that's why it's such an important concept, and that's why I feel that it will also stay important.
Okay, thank you.
I know you just wanted, can I say something? I think that I talked about two types of power, the network power plus the narrative power. The nation state won't go away because we still tell stories about the nation state.
Okay.
And so as long as we continue to tell those stories, then we are going to continue, and that addresses the previous question as well. Those narratives embody our sense of reality, and those, Ben talked about the importance of borders. Well, I'm not sure that the borders concept plays as well when it comes to those narratives. We did a study on ISIL, and one of the ways we found that you could track ISIL on Twitter, they quickly learned you couldn't use follower leader networks on Twitter because Twitter would shut you down. But the way they organized their discourse was by using a hashtag called "When will you migrate?" Now that is a very powerful narrative that a good Muslim must migrate to the Islamic State. So there was a technological mechanism for reinforcing that narrative. And I think that's really the reality that you're talking about.
Okay, I might come back to you because I have another question, but I'll let, Okay, thank you.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kelly from the United States Naval Academy. My question is for Dr. Pandith. How specifically can civil society and activism in general promote a healthy identity for Muslims abroad that would be effective in defeating radical Islam?
So how can civil society help Muslims overseas with their identity?
How can they promote a healthy identity? What specifically?
So I think it's, and that's a great question. Look, what I meant when I said that it's what we do every single day, I am not talking about holding hands and singing Kumbaya and isn't the world a lovely place. I know everybody would like to do that, but let's get real, right? I am talking, though, about how we use words, how we think about what is perceived as Americans, right? I think in the last few days, there have been a lot of really interesting things that have happened between American Jews and American Muslims because of the rise of anti-Semitism and that horrifying thing that happened in the cemetery Minnesota, where was it? St. Louis, excuse me. And so the images were really profound, and I'm using that because it's a very local thing, right? Those images ricocheted all over the world, and so it debunked any idea for a lot of folks that in fact America was out to get Muslims. Now, it lasted for a second. I don't know how long it will stay, but I do know that more and more and more of those things can actually outpace the narratives that we try to put out as government, right? So as citizens in America, we have to do more to talk about who we are as Americans, what our Constitution is all about. That will help, by the way, the identity crisis for Muslims overseas, because they're watching the Muslims in our country and they're saying, oh my gosh, they can be modern and Muslim, they can be proud Americans and proud Muslims, they can practice their faith and do whatever, I can too. It connects.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello there. My name is Caio. I'm from the University of São Paulo in Brazil. And Dr. Pandith, I would like to ask you a question. Considering that you do a lot of policy making regarding the Islamic population here in the U.S., and we have kind of a success story in Brazil and in Latin America in general, dealing with Islamic communities. Suriname has a big one, and they're even considering themselves to host the Islamic International Court. But we don't do much. We don't have active policy making towards Islam. So my question is, wouldn't it be wiser to have a more passive or more liberal approach towards policy making in Islamic communities and in the Islamic world in general to avoid conflicts?
I'm not 100% sure I understood what you were getting at, but let me just try to get at get an answer. Two things. One is I did visit Muslims in Brazil and Argentina and Suriname and Guyana. Okay, and although the populations are super small, what I talked about during my 12 minutes was present there too. That identity crisis that was happening for them had a lot to do with the way in which they were absorbing the larger Muslim narrative of what it might mean to be Muslim. So, for example, even when I was in Faz do Iguaçu, forgive my pronunciation of that, young Muslims were talking to me, whether I was in Sao Paulo even, anywhere, that they did not feel like they could be true Muslims, and they wanted guidance to be able to do that. So when we are looking at the global Muslim population and policymakers around, we aren't looking at telling Muslims how to be Muslim. What I meant about policymakers need to understand the identity crisis is not to decide what kind of Muslim they need to be, but rather that one, we need to engage with Muslims around the world because 1/4 of the planet's Muslim. We need to listen to what it is that they're saying, not presume to know how they're feeling and what they're doing. And thirdly, to underscore in every kind of political or policy decision that we're making that the generation that has undergone this crisis of identity is important to us because the bad guys know they are and we have to factor that in. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just meaning to understand, why do you think there isn't such a radicalization in the Muslim communities in South America, whereas you could have that factor in Europe or in the U.S.?
So there is, and we can talk about that offline.
Sure thing.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nico, and I'm a senior at Connecticut College. Mr. Sachs, I really like that you brought up the concept of essentially extending national boundaries into radio frequencies. That's fascinating, and I'd like to combine my question with kind of your concept and Dr. Clover's kind of analysis of Facebook friends. My question is, do we have a moral obligation, and I mean a moral obligation, to not only connect the world, but also ensure that online usage is really productive and is also kind of guided by a sort of constitution? And applying that constitutional law to this media outlet, which is kind of like an alternate reality or an alternate nation, how do we do that? How do we not impede on people's right to free speech in censoring certain parts of the media and allowing kind of other people to kind of voice their opinions?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a critical question, and it goes back to the fact that we are sort of at this moment of media change where where traditional law of free speech, and this is both at the domestic level and in international human rights law, is not keeping up with the swiftly diversifying forms of media that there are. And I think, at least from my assessment, that during the Cold War, certainly there was very little freedom of speech in Warsaw Pact media and in the Soviet Union. But the same was not the case in the Western countries. There was, however, an agreement to not discuss certain topics. And there was what we now know, because of declassified files, there was more of a government hand in media that we trust or we take for being quote-unquote neutral or free, such as the BBC or Radio France, than we used to think, and that was actually done deliberately. We now know it's called the Transmission X policy. The problem is that the end of the Cold War, the supposed end of the Cold War, and then the recent events post-September 11th have really thrown all that into flux. And from what I understand, but I think my colleague can probably speak to this with greater expertise, is that traditional rules are not keeping up. So I think what we might see in the next 5 to 10 years is a lot of civil cases, a lot of legal battles over where particular broadcasts or media or comments. I will bring up one example which comes to mind, which was that a man was jailed a few years ago for tweeting that he would attack the Robin Hood International Airport in Britain, in Nottingham, Britain. Now, he was arrested on charges of plotting to or threatening to blow up an airport. The issue was the real contentious issue, however, was he exercising his freedom of speech? Because he was communicating on Twitter, he said it was a joke, he didn't follow up with it, there was no evidence of materials found that could be explosive. He was, however, convicted. Now that pertains only to British law, but it did set a worrying precedent about the limitations that a government would permit in the West on freedom of speech, and it does, in fact, to get back to your original point, it does set up in a way a border and a boundary about what the state expects and how it expects that other states will recognize its opinions.
Thank you. My name is Dimitri. I'm from Moscow State Institute of International Relations. My question is mostly addressed to Mr. Sachs, I guess, but also to the broader panel, because it's related to borders, physical and otherwise. I was surprised to hear that there was little to no mention of a concept that is quite ubiquitous in panel discussions in Russia, China, other places, and that is sovereignty. Mm-hmm. What is happening to sovereignty and how is it changing?
I think that's a great question. I did try to touch on it briefly, but of course it was only we only allocated about 10 to 12 minutes. So what I was trying to describe in my theory of the wobble, which I think this should be a better name for it, but that's how I see it at the moment, is that as long as the sovereignty, the integral sovereignty of a nation state is not immediately threatened, or at least the perception of its sovereignty isn't threatened, then it's not seen as any sort of border, particularly a bilateral border dispute, particularly a small one, is not normally seen as being particularly critical or threatening. There's numerous examples of this, particularly with U.S.-Canadian relations, or when Canada was still British, or even post-Confederation in 1865, which have been not seen as threatening. The problem is that we're seeing more and more conflicts where sovereignty is being threatened, and that, again, even if the border issue in itself is small, because the way that the country and its people has sort of arranged and organized themselves around their national identity, around their borders, so the idea of a border as an integral part of identity, it's becoming more of a threat to sovereignty when those borders are threatened. I hope that makes some sense. Yes?
Could I just add one word to this, because I think I appreciate the question very much, and I know that Russians think a lot about sovereignty, so do Ukrainians. And I think that case actually says something very important about the importance of borders. Mm-hmm. That it may be one thing for a Canadian Mountie to cross the American border by mistake when he's doing something, and it's true that doesn't lead to war between the United States and Canada. And perhaps one way of interpreting that is to say that the U.S.-Canadian border is a little wobbly. But another way of thinking about it is that we've had a peaceful order in Europe mostly since 1945, because we've had very well-established borders that have been accepted by the nations of Europe and defended. And that the definition of those borders is part of the thing that has kept the peace. And one of the things that has happened in the last couple of years, I'm sure that's not what you wanted to hear in asking the question, but I'm sorry to say it, is that for the first time in a very long time, a nation has invaded the sovereign territory of another nation in Europe and annexed large parts of its territory. So sovereignty is important, and borders are important precisely in order to have a clear understanding of where national sovereignty lies, and in order to avoid the kind of messy and deadly civil war we now have on the wobbly border between the Ukraine and Russia.
Just one last thing. You start to worry about sovereignty when you feel yours is threatened. And I think if you look at the 2016 election in the U.S., it was an issue about sovereignty. Sovereignty hasn't gone away. The networks, though, undermine sense of sovereignty. This is one of the issues that drives China's response to the internet, is they want to maintain some form of network sovereignty, some form of internet sovereignty. This is why I mentioned earlier the debate over ICON that went on for several years was finally resolved. Most people paid absolutely no attention to it because it was so boring, but it was actually a really, really important thing of trying to figure out how do we talk through these issues of sovereignty and what role does the nation state have in controlling not just hardware, but in controlling the content of the internet.
Good afternoon. My name is Art Gibb. I'm an instructor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Thank you all for your comments today and your appearance here. A recurring theme throughout the morning and afternoon has been the power of ideas. And Dr. Pandith, you leverage that in particular with this narrative of idealism and diversity, and how would we get that out there. The pathways to channel ideas involve literacy and technology. And as we saw from Dr. Kluver's maps, the places where the majority of this at-risk population lives has neither. Is that a challenge? It is a challenge, I would assume, to the spread of this narrative. How do we overcome that?
So first of all, I have great respect for what you do. So thank you for teaching the next generation.
Thank you. It's my honor, my privilege.
And I should have said to those of you who are here, thank you for your service to our nation. I would say, I'm going to push back at you just a little bit, because in my experience, when we started looking at around 2006 or so, as we were framing the ideological component of this, we were, as you know, looking at specific regions of the world, thinking these are the hot spots, this is where we really need to look, and whether you're looking at Boko in Nigeria, or Pakistan or Afghanistan at the time, right? You're thinking about those kinds of questions. Well, what has happened to me over the course of the last few years is that, I have seen, and you have too, that in fact, you can be here in Boston, literally in Boston, and see a Tsarnaev, kid get radicalized, or you can be in a very remote part of the world and see that too. And so I struggle a lot with this idea that we have to look at who has the ability to have a phone in their hand, or who has the ability to read, because what I know and what I believe to be the answer on how to stop this is to combine both what's happening in the offline space with what's happening in the online space. So to your point, how do we think about the places that are not connected and get ideas? And that's where the traditional side of things, and it's something that obviously DoD has done a lot with, state has not been as robust around those issues until much later. AID came to the game much, much too late. And I think one of the big questions for this next administration is how are we going to square that? Because you cannot just have I read something in Reuters this morning that, Secretary Mattis's plan is going to be a communications plan, and I was like, what? It's far more, with respect to him, it has to be far more than that, because I know that it's happening one-on-one, and I know it's happening in an offline space, and I know, to the person who asked the question about how individuals can make a difference, it's the entire environment that has to shift so that the us and them narrative doesn't come forward. So I give you a lot to think about in terms of your answer. The headline really is, don't just look at the regions, don't just look at the hotspots. It's not what a military person wants to hear, because you want to be able to be organized about how we do this. And when I tell everybody it's global, everyone, they get really mad at me, but I'm going to answer it that way. I'm sorry.
No, I understand, and I guess my thought was that where we have that connectivity, your narrative spreads much easier. Right. But the real challenge might be where we don't have that connectivity.
And that's why the local, what I call credible voices matter, and it's why U.S. government can't pick who those people are. It's why you have to talk to Muslims and say, who's going to make a difference for that 13-year-old kid? And if it's that hip-hop guy or it's the graffiti artist, you need to give them platforms so that they can do what they can do.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, we have been granted 5 more minutes for this panel, and so what I'm going to do to close this out is I'm going to have everyone who's left standing ask their question, then I'm going to ask a question because I have the power to do that, and then all of the panelists are going to sort of get a moment for closing statements, responding to questions asked to them, and we will close up by 4:15. David.
Hello, David Larkin from the Naval Academy. So my question is for Dr. Pandith. You talked about engaging Muslims and presenting these counter-narratives, but when President Obama did this, he oftentimes came under intense domestic fire for that engagement. How do you sell this idea of giving these counter-narratives, especially if you're talking about private sector, to the American public when a huge portion of the country's population and lawmakers view America as at war with Islam and think hard power is the most effective way to deal with this problem of terrorism? And how might American identity play a part in that?
Right. Hi, my name is Daniel Lewis. I'm a freshman member of the EPIIC class of 2017. And my question is mostly for Dr. Kluver, pertaining to the graph you put up where you can essentially see that there are monopolies of information through Facebook and other, depending on your region, through other companies. And related to what Dr. Pandith has been discussing, what is the role of social networking companies and enterprises in actually regulating some of this information? And especially if we're trying to change this narrative, is it something where we are claiming moral superiority and we force that upon these companies, or is it something where they let everything go freely and they don't actually regulate it?
Hello, my name is Daniel, and I am from Peking University, China. I have one question for Dr. Mounk. If one thing rises in globalization time, it is uncertainty. So for me, other than a trilemma, I think it's more like a dilemma in which globalization is on one side and most of the rest on the other side. So do you think is this the way it has to be, and how should we live in a world like this? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Summer from National University of Singapore, and I'm originally from China. So, as we know, Singapore is a small country that is like deeply exposed to the global trade. But interestingly, the national education in Singapore is sometimes like they place stronger emphasis as compared to what I saw in China. And so I have one question specifically about small states. How should small countries balance between national states identity and globalization? And how is it different from the approach of big countries like China and the US? Thank you.
All right, thank you all. My closing question is, we've discussed a lot the question of inclusion or formation of identity for nation states, and so to bring us back to the future of the nation state, how can policymakers find a balance between including outsiders or those not typically accepted by the nation state and defining the national identity in order to stabilize both their communities and the global community? I think we'll just go down the line addressing the questions.
Wonderful, and I'll address that head on. I think that I would love to live in a world, in some ways, I would love to live in a world without nation states. For a good part of my life, I was committed to some kind of post-national vision. So perhaps I am a convert of sort to the idea of a nation state, because I think that that's very dangerous. That one of the reasons why we've seen the rise of this very dangerous populism, and to some degree also a reason why we've seen the rise of other kinds of ideologies and religious ideologies take on, become so attractive, is that we haven't managed to tell people that the nation state still matters on a political level, haven't been able to define a patriotism which is not exclusionary, which gives people the sense that the nation state can do something for them, and which includes Muslims in the United States, people who are of different ethnic origin in Europe, into the nation. And so I think that nice as it is, say, that a lot of people are using Facebook around the world, I would love to know, and I don't know if you happen to have those statistics, okay, so 2 billion people in the world use Facebook every month. I would love to know what percentage of the Facebook friends of US citizens are also US citizens and residents. I would bet a large amount of money that it's over 95%. I would bet a good amount of money that it's over 99%. So it may be that, somebody in Springfield, Missouri is using Facebook, and somebody, Mexico City is using Facebook too, and somebody in Munich is using Facebook too, but they're using it to talk to people who are in their communities, and particularly in the national communities. And so I think we have to face up to that, and we have to face up to the fact that the nation state is not going to go away, and that we either fill it with a meaning that is peaceful and forward-looking and gives people hope of including everybody in a national community that makes sense, or it's going to be filled by people who have an exclusionary idea of nationalism and use that to show up conflict. So I think it's a matter of how to fill patriotism in the nation with a meaning that we can all coalesce around, rather than vacating the space of a nation to people who will always continue to talk about it in the most exclusionary possible terms.
So let me address the question about what's the role of social media companies. Social media companies actually try to regulate this content through their terms of use, and they do not respond necessarily to national law. They write into their terms of use, you can't do this. For example, you can't put on a video of beheading somebody. And so one of the things we did when we did our ISIL study is we tried to track ISIL accounts. But one of the things we found is that Twitter was removing those accounts as fast as they popped up. We did consult with folks in the U.S. government to say, are you interacting with Twitter on this? And they said, oh, absolutely, we can't do that. But Twitter used its own terms of use to regulate those kinds of content. When we talk about Facebook, Facebook's not a network. Facebook's 700 million networks, right? And so just because you're on Facebook doesn't mean that you're all, holding hands singing Kumbaya. It means that you're using that to reinforce narratives. I mean, where I grew up, people voted 80 to 20% for Trump, right? My high school friends, I read those, I know that narrative, right? So I heard that, and it was a very closed, just as all my liberal university professor friends, were the opposite direction. I wanted to address the question of small states. Look at 3 small states in particular. You mentioned Singapore, look at Finland, look at Qatar. Singapore in the 1960s made itself relevant to the global network. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at what Lee Kuan Yew said, he said, we had to make ourselves relevant to the Western world. So we educated all our people in English, we developed manufacturing industries that would appeal to Britain, to the United States, but by the way, they offered property ownership to the Russians as well. Singapore was very strategic in inserting itself in certain geopolitical networks. Go back to the 1990s with Qatar. Qatar made an initial investment of $40 million in Al Jazeera and thereby changed the world. So a small state with something like 200,000, 250,000 Qataris, only 1 million people in the country, now is a major, major geopolitical player on the basis of Al Jazeera. And on the basis of Al Jazeera, they've been able to get the World Cup soccer tournament, they've been able to get massive tennis tournaments, they've been able to get an entire round of the World Economic Forum named after them. So, so it's an exercise in inserting yourself in the right network. It's a perfect example, I think, of network power.
Al Jazeera also gave oxygen to a guy named Osama bin Laden. But I won't go there. Okay. Really good question about sort of Obama tried to do this. He got totally nailed because of the political culture we're in America. I'm a realist, so I'm going to tell you what I think about this. Government right now will not be able to do this. There is no way. I have been thinking about this since the election, and this is an apolitical comment. I don't think you're going to see this White House shift its lexicon, shift the way they think about things, and change into something that we wish them to be around the issue that I've described. So I think that the way we have to look at this is if you can't get the White House to say the right things using the bully pulpit of the White House, who can? And I think there's great power in the forces outside of the government to be able to do that. And the question that was asked is, how do you get private sector and citizens to get on board? And that's how you get them to get on board. Because if they think the government's going to do it, they won't. But if you tell them, and we have proof that we're going down a particular path, the threat is not decreasing, folks. If you think just because we have defeated ISIS, we've won the game, we have not. This is so much bigger than ISIS. And I don't think people quite understand that. This ideology is terrifying, okay? And today we're looking at it as, you know, what's happening in Mosul, and as bad as what's happening in the Middle East, it is going to get far worse if we do not contain it. So what you have to say to big bet philanthropists, what you have to say to regular citizens, and what you have to say to anybody else that will listen is, if governments aren't going to do it, let's get on board. We did not defeat, well, I shouldn't say defeat, we did not get to a place with AIDS that we are in today, 30 years after we discovered it, because government did everything right. We got to this place because people outside of government said, we can't, we've got to figure out a way to fix this, which is why when somebody is diagnosed, they have an alternative path now. That's what we have to do with this.
Thanks. I would just like to briefly comment on two of the two things that I found really fascinating that were discussed here on the panel. And the one comment goes to Yascha. I agree with 99% of what you said. I think that's really spot on. But I wanted to put a question mark behind one remark that you said in your opening statement about whether it's really about the economy or not. You mentioned that countries that are economically stable might be more open to immigration, basically. And I think that when we look at Europe, that's not what we see these days, because when you look at Spain, which is really anything but economically stable, you don't see any right-wing populist anti-immigration movements there at all. The right-wing anti-immigration movements are extremely popular in the very affluent northern European countries. So that's just, I think that, you know, that I think it's just not about the economy in this point, you know, and that's what we have to understand. It goes beyond that. It's about identity, which is why it's a fitting title for this panel. And the other comment I wanted to make was on Benjamin, because I really thought it was fascinating what you said about the perception of a border. And when I bring that back to the debate on what happened in Germany in the last couple of years, I think that really Merkel might lose the elections in September because she destroyed the perception of a border. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about what she did. It was that she did it, and then she said, yeah, sorry, folks, there's just no alternative to destroying the perception of a border. And that's effectively what she did, and that is effectively what many of her former voters will not and cannot forgive. I mean, I have a printout of the AfD election manifesto here, and the title is, if I translate it, Give Back State Control to the People. Because, and I think that the notion that is really important is this notion of a loss of control. And that's where this perception of a border and to sort of give up the notion of a border comes into play and is very, very important. And I think that, you know, giving advice to a chancellor, why shouldn't I? You know, she should have taken a page from what Justin Trudeau did in Canada, you know, because Trudeau didn't say, oh, sorry guys, but in the 21st century we can't have borders anymore, so get used to it. He said, well, you know, we want to carry our moral responsibility. We are willing to contribute to this endeavor. We are willing to say yes to Syrian refugees. But he didn't combine it with a sort of imperial overstretch to declare that, sorry, but the nation state is history and we have to get used to that. I think that was a very wise course of action.
And I'll just run with that just conclude briefly that I think, again, going back to the Trudeau example, which I think is very accurate, is that the perception of control over a border, however imagined that border may be or not may be, is critical to stability, both and also to the rise of the curtailment of a particular populist movement. I think I'll finish on the Singapore example. Now, I'm not by any means an expert on Singapore. We have someone else on the panel who's much better versed on that than I am. But when I think Singapore, I actually do not think about its diminutive physical geography. I think about its assets. I think about the fact that it's a leader in, it has redefined the airline industry in many ways. I think about its financial institutions and the way that it has sort of structured its government and economic models for small states and for city-states. It's been reproduced elsewhere in places like Brunei and so on. And to me, that's the kind of border we might see. It's not necessarily a negative thing. I don't think we need to see borders as negatives or particularly as positives. They're, I think, for the foreseeable future, they're going to be a necessary fact in our society for many reasons. But what you see is that Singapore tries to define a rule set for itself, and that may come from the government, it may come from civil rights or grassroots organizations, but as those rules are more and more respected and recognized, and other actors in the international community recognize and behave within those guidelines, you see that it becomes, that border, so quote-unquote, becomes recognized. And so, looking at, for instance, Singapore and the airline industry, you now have in 2017 most airlines in the world signing up to the way that Singapore Airlines sort of ideal model is, and then the way that they regulate themselves in the airline industry. So, in a nutshell, borders, like history has shown, are going to stay, but as also history has shown, they're going to remain extremely fluid.
I just wanted to thank all of our speakers for being here. If we could have another round of applause. And this panel will be followed by small group discussion sessions, I believe in the Olin building. The locations can be found in your program. Thank you so much for being here, and we will come back together at 7 p.m. for the keynote tonight.
You did a really nice job.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
I really enjoyed what you had to say. Thank you so much.